Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Reprisal Universe. While it's a game that certainly wears its influences on its sleeve, it claims in the game itself that it's a homage to the one and only Populous. It is inspired very much by that. It's a tribute. And it's very, very, very similar to the original Populous. We're not talking about the beginning here. No. We're talking about the original Populous, the original God game by Peter Molyneux back in the day. This is a pseudo-sequel, I suppose. Let's just call it a successor to a free web game that was done on Congregate. And this is a full standalone version that has some rather vague, passive multiplayer elements that don't really explain themselves too well. But outside of that, it plays very similar to Populous, which is why I was interested in having a look at it, because I loved Populous back in the day. So have a quick look at the options menu, and then we'll jump right into it. Not really much to see here, honestly. There's the inspiration right there, as you can see. Graphics options, not a lot. You got basic and artistic. Artistic means that it uses a bunch of blur and depth of field on the stuff around the edge of the viewport, which is not particularly helpful in my opinion, so I usually leave that off. You then got zoom normal and zoom full, which will do that. It's sort of rendering the game at the same sort of size, and you can put it in a window or not if you so desire. And that is pretty much about it. I'd say, where's the separate volume sliders, but the game, outside of the menus, doesn't actually have any music, so it doesn't need separate volume sliders. It's a little bit odd. So let's jump into the game and show you exactly how this works. This probably won't take too long, honestly. Explaining Populous is not particularly tricky. Alright, here we go. So, I am against a rival god on this map, and I'm going to start reshaping the terrain. Does this remind you of Populous? It bloody well should, because these are the mechanics of Populous. Your basic godlike power is the ability to reshape terrain, and reshaping terrain, and more specifically flattening it out, allows your subjects to build progressively larger domiciles, up to castles, as you can see right there. Now, after that, what you can do is you can kick them out, and they can go and build some other stuff, or alternatively, they can follow other orders, such as go to waypoint, or look for a fight. Now, the Kindle functionality there is something that I'll get onto in a little bit, because it's a key mechanic to the game, and also, one could argue that it's to its detriment. There we go, so just a little bit of resizing right here. This is probably reminding you a little bit of Goddess if you haven't actually played Populous, but of course Goddess is the spiritual successor to Populous made by Peter Molyneux's 22 Cans. This is a tribute. I mean, this is a Populous tribute band, really, when you think about it. This is Populous. That's what you're playing right now. Okay, let's kindle a few more out there. There we go. That's going to send a few people wandering around. Now, each level has a few objectives, and usually it's get the totem and then destroy the enemy. So they're creating a leader there, so I assume they're going to go fight. There's the totem. It's actually right in the middle of their territory, so we'll probably want to try and kill them. And of course, how do we do that? Well, we spend the mana, which is accrued at the bottom of the screen and is accrued by having larger houses and more worshippers, on dropping horrible, horrible things on them. In fact, they're trying to drop horrible things on me, but the AI seems to be lacking any semblance of common sense and decided to aim a lightning storm at a tiny house instead of the center of my domain. Not really all that ideal. I will not make the same mistake, that I guarantee you. Here is a column of fire which is now burning its way through his territory and moving at random. So, as you collect totems, you will be able to unlock new godlike powers. This basic terrain reshaping is something that you get really from the very start and is essential when it comes to dealing with creating a large worshipper base. Just can't do it otherwise, because the terrain is too much of a mess. They'll create tiny little forts, and more importantly, when the citizens actually come out of those tiny little huts and smaller domiciles, they're not going to have the kind of attack power that you need to really battle. It looks like he wants to attack, and you can even see that this is sort of where he's focusing his attention, and he sent out a bunch of knights. I'm not massively worried by that, although we could make things a little bit easier by dropping a lightning storm on his advancing army, and we will, although we have also done damage to the terrain there. So they're going to attack, and they're going to try and take out some of my buildings, which I'm going to try and prevent them from doing if it's all possible. I'll probably lose this one. Now, if I want my citizens to go and run and attack a bunch of them, then I can kindle by doing that, which for some inexplicable reason causes a massive drop in frame rate. The frame rate of this game is actually terrible. Really surprisingly terrible. Very, very strange. I noticed that it was locked to 30, but it actually goes down about 15, which is really weird. You barely notice it because this plays like a game that was made in the early 90s on the Amiga. That's because Populous was a game released in 1989 on the Amiga. So there's no real big surprises there, but I'm just really, really shocked to see the frame rate counter go all over the bloody place. It's really quite surprising. But it plays like Populous. And is that what you're looking for? All right, well, you can probably just stop watching this video right now because it is a Populous clone and it does the sort of things that Populous does pretty well. However, I'd like to go a little bit more in depth on the mechanics. Is merely creating a Populous clone good enough? Is there something that they could have done to improve it? Well, the first problem that I have with it really is the Kindle mechanic, as I was discussing earlier. You might say, well, why do you have a problem with the Kindle mechanic? Well, it's not so much the mechanic that I have a problem with. In the old Populous games, you could kick people out of their buildings by deforming the land around them to make their home smaller, which would force them to go over population cap, which would kick out a civilian or a tribesman who would wander around. You could use that as a good way of getting people up to fight. So in this game, instead of doing that, you could still do that, by the way, they decided to put it in a mechanic called Kindle, which is you click or drag over the house, and it will kick out a citizen. Now, ideally, you don't want to do this too much because the citizen it's going to kick out is weaker than one who would have spawned in the first place. If you have a look at these flags on the side of the buildings here, these flags represent just how much population the building has, and once the flag's raised to full height, they will kick out a new person, and that person will wander around and either attack or try and build a new home. And that's how you expand your population and your mana base and your worshipper base. Now, in the old game, the way to do that was to deform the terrain around them, as I mentioned. Now they put in a mechanic called kindling, which in and of itself is fine, because what you can actually do is instead of going hugely clicky, you can just kind of drag like that, yeah? And it spawns a bunch of civilians who will go around. I'm just going to actually order them around to fight now. I'm going to drop another lightning storm on them. There we go. Let's just try and just devastate this, guys. Shouldn't be too difficult. I've got a lot of very, very strong houses, as you can see, so I've got a lot of strong tribesmen. However, it seems like they've designed the levels around the idea that you have to kindle, and you have to do it quickly. You've got to expand fast, because the AI is highly aggressive, especially in the early levels, and this causes some massive difficulty spikes until you realize exactly what's going on. And if you mess up your terrain reshaping and terraforming early on, when you don't have a lot of mana, you can actually end up losing because you get rushed by the AI and then you get absolutely devastated. Now, honestly, in Populous, which had about 500 levels, by the way, the original Populous, a lot of the levels really weren't that stressful, and you actually had a good amount of time to slowly build up your tribe and then eventually get into a little bit of a scrap. Because of the emphasis on spawning a lot of soldiers quickly with the kindling mechanic, it means that a lot of these levels are designed really around rushing about the place. Which means there's perhaps a bit of excessive micromanagement, although I think a lot of people just don't know that you can use a sort of paintbrush style idea with Kindle and just drag them over instead of clicking on each individual one, because that's what I thought you had to do originally. And frankly, that's the fault of the game, because the game's tutorial is pretty weak source, and it doesn't seem to have a manual either, which is not exactly ideal, I have to say. But once you figure that out, it's actually pretty easy to kindle out a large number of tribesmen to go and do your bidding. And indeed, you can control them even further. If I just want to place a waypoint, which I'm going to do, and then we say go to waypoint, then I'm going to get all of my guys heading in that general direction, and I can do things like create a powerful leader avatar and all sorts of things like that. And the further I get into the game, the more of these spells I end up unlocking. There's actually quite a lot of them. At the moment, I can only do things like Fire Column and Lightning Storm, but eventually you'll be able to do all sorts of things. I believe this is Summon a Swamp, which people will get stuck in and drown. There we go. So I've now collected the Swamp Totem, and I also have a leader who's gathering around here. So all of my tribesmen are going to walk into that, and they're going to power up my leader, and he's going to be an unholy avatar of destruction. At least that's the general idea. So I think it comes down to the game not properly explaining some of its mechanics, and it also comes down to the idea that the game just deviates, I think, from the Populous formula in the wrong kind of ways. Populous was actually quite a relaxed game, whereas Reprisal is a very aggressive game from the very outset when you're dealing with the AI, and I think that caught a lot of people off guard, which is a little bit unfortunate. So we can pop a swamp down. Can we do a swamp? There we go. Cool. So anyone that walks into that bubbling swamp will most likely drown. Well, and we have a powerful leader now, so we can go send him off to battle, and we can destroy the heathens, as Populous is all about. There's a couple of UI issues that I've got with it. There's no middle mouse button scroll, which would be very, very useful, I feel. Also, the viewport is extremely restrictive for no real reason. I think it's just down to perhaps an unnecessary adoration of what Populous was. Back in the day, Populous had a very, very limited viewport, and the UI was not particularly well designed. You could scroll, I think you could scroll with the keyboard if I remember correctly, but a lot of the scrolling actually happened with these 8-way scroll buttons that were located on the UI. And hey, back in the day, the UIs of strategy games were often extremely clumsy. There's no real excuse for that in 2014, and the only way to scroll around the map is to either use the WASD keys or to drag the minimap. There's no push scroll or middle mouse scroll at all. Okay, am I going to have enough mana to flatten this? I certainly hope so. If I don't, I'm going to be in serious trouble. This is what I was talking about. If you mess up your early deformation of terrain, you can actually end up really far behind really fast. What I want to do is flatten this entire area down, but I have so little mana. I think I'm just going to have to actually expand this out to make sure I get a larger house so that my mana starts coming in at a good rate. There we go. Now I can actually do something. That's good, that's good. There we go. Much, much better. It's a strange thing indeed that we need proper communication of mechanics that have been around for, what, almost 30 years now. It's a little bit silly, but such is the way of it. Even if you're making a homage to a particular game, you still need to properly explain, especially when you make changes like adding the Kindle mechanic in. The game does a fairly poor job, in my opinion, of explaining just how important that mechanic is, and you eventually learn it, certainly. What would be lovely is a better explanation of that, better emphasis on it, and more to the point, just adding basic things like hotkeys. Does the UI have to be as basic as it currently is? I don't know if there are hotkeys for this, because there are no tooltips. And I've seen a rash of games that don't do tooltips lately, and it really bothers me. It's like, did we forget how useful tooltips actually are? Extremely handy. Very, very good. Please do tooltips in games. Like, there's never a good reason, in my opinion, not to do tooltips. Maybe it's the curse of mobile development and the inability to do tooltips that way. Maybe that had something to do with it. I really, really do not know. But outside of that, it's a pretty decent Populous clone that doesn't really do a huge amount differently, and it seems to almost revel in the fact that it doesn't do a huge amount differently. What it does do is have this rather strange pseudo-multiplayer universe mode where you go to these different universes and they have different levels, and supposedly you're able to like leave a legacy on an island and you see how many people have visited that area, but the game never explains what a legacy actually is, and even digging around on the forums, I found very vague references to this idea of leaving your legacy. What is a legacy? How do I acquire it? I don't even know what any of that is all about. It's an interesting idea, but again, game doesn't explain it very well, so it's a bit of a problem. The lack of music's also a little bit disturbing as well. I mean, why would there be a lack of music? I think if there was a lot of really nice ambient sound, you could probably get away with it, but the game doesn't actually have that either, so I'm not 100% convinced. No. It's a decent enough Populous clone, although I have to say that what I want, I think, is a Populous-style game that takes some of the ideas from Populous and the principles behind Populous. What I'm saying is I want a decent God game, and currently Goddess isn't one, so I'm looking for another one, and I stumbled upon Reprisal Universe, and what I found was a clone of a game that I played 20 plus years ago, and the thing is that I could still play that, although there would be there's certainly some interface issues. I think there's actually a couple of open source versions of Populous that I could probably play there too. I'm not 100% convinced as to the game's relevance and whether or not we really needed Populous tribute, but if you think that we do, then this game is a decent enough Populous tribute. It just doesn't really do anything else particularly well. And they've also managed to make a game which actually, in my opinion, has less graphical charm and perhaps even less graphical capability than the original. And fine, I respect your kind of pixel art aesthetic, that's fine. But perhaps making it look a little less like Populous or like an indie version of Populous would have helped. It looks close enough to Populous, but in my opinion actually has a weaker aesthetic. But that perhaps is an entirely subjective criticism. I played a bit of it. I had a little bit of nostalgia as a direct result of it. I boggled at the fact that the frame rate goes all over the place, which I suppose is also a faithful interpretation of the Amiga version, right? It's still fun to drop fantastic powers upon people, and I'd like to play in maybe a little bit more to see if there are any other different powers available. There's apparently the ability to place a forest, but I have no idea what this does. Why is... Okay, trees are growing, and this does what exactly? I don't know. Game never says so. It would have probably been a lot stronger if it had a proper multiplayer mode instead of the sort of passive idea that they've got going on there. It would be nice to play a little bit of multiplayer Populous clone, but ultimately I was perhaps hoping to see a game that evolved on the formula rather than merely try to ape it, which is what Reprisal Universe does. Now, if of course you're looking for a game that apes Populous, then outside of some UI issues and I think questionable pacing and an overuse of the Kindle mechanic, especially early on, then you'll probably find that Reprisal Universe will fill your needs for the time being. It's not an expensive game. It's around $10. But I suppose that I hoped for maybe a little bit of bravery with the formula, and that's not what I really see here. I simply see a Populous tribute band, and it's good enough, but all it really does is remind me how cool Populous was back in the day, and makes me a little sad that we don't have God games like that coming out at a reasonable pace at this point. So there you go. Reprisal Universe, ladies and gentlemen, it's currently available on our sponsor GOG, as well as Steam for $10, or your regional equivalent. Decent enough Populous clone, although, in my opinion, doesn't really stand on its own merits. It's more a nostalgia trip for games gone by. My name's been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.